Good morning. First of all, let me say how absolutely delighted I am to have the opportunity to come to Istanbul and to be able to talk to you about timeless principles and changing trends. And I hope that my theme relates to both of those, because I'm going to talk about some very old things and some very new things. When we all talk about language teaching and learning, we all like to think that we're up to date, okay? That we're doing, the most fashionable and the most contemporary thing, the thing that's most suited to the contemporary world. But what I want to do in this talk is challenge some of those ideas and suggest that some of the things that we assume are up to date are actually have become are actually very old and may be in need of rethinking, in the context of the changes in the modern world. Two things that everybody tends to assume are good about language teaching. One is the idea that the best way to teach or learn a language is through the medium of that language itself, without reference to the student's own language, without the use of translation, and so on and so forth. A second, and that idea is actually about 130 years old, right? That's been considered, the latest fashion since the late 19th century, okay? And the other idea, which everybody takes for granted, is that one should focus exclusively on meaning and communication and keep away from any explicit discussion of language form. Well, that's not a new idea anymore. That's been around for about 50 years, okay? And I want in this talk to question both of those ideas. And to illustrate some of the themes that I want to exploit, okay, I want to tell you an anecdote from my own life, okay? I've been talking about things being around for a long time. Well, I've been around for a long time as well, okay? So my first teaching job was a very long time ago, 1974, okay? And I was young and idealistic. Now I'm old and idealistic. And I wanted to go and teach on a British scheme called voluntary service overseas, where you go and work in a poorer country for not for very much money, and so on and so forth. I actually wanted to go to Jamaica. So I asked voluntary service overseas if they would send me to Jamaica, and they sent me instead to Egypt, to a boys' secondary school in Luxor, a very nice place to go. And as a prelude to that job, I was sent on an intensive course in spoken colloquial Egyptian Arabic, okay? 1974, right? So this was a very state-of-the-art modern course for those days, right? So it was taught by native speakers. There was no writing, there was no translation, there was no explanation, there was no grammar, okay? We just, it was all very communicative. So we played, we did role play. We were waiters and customers and bus conductors and passengers and people who couldn't find their way to the station and all that kind of thing. And you were not allowed to ask for a translation or any explanation of what was happening. So you see, that was kind of state-of-the-art, absolutely up-to-date teaching. But that's 50 years ago, 1974. 40 years ago, roughly. Okay, so I'm a student on this course, and I was very frustrated because I actually like a bit of translation and explanation, okay? So there was a sequence of sounds that I heard the Arabic teachers saying, okay? And to my shame, I'd never heard this sequence of sounds. It was something like inshallah, okay? So I thought, well, I wonder, what does this mean, okay? But I wasn't allowed to ask, right? So it was only outside the classroom that I was allowed to ask. Outside the classroom, which was a real communicative situation, we were allowed to use English and ask for explanations and so on and so forth. So I said to one of the teachers, what does that mean, this sequence of sounds, inshallah? You have to say sequence of sounds, because if you're taught in this communicative way, you don't know where the word boundaries are, okay? So he said, well, it means perhaps, okay? So, fine. And then he said, as a kind of parenthesis, like a little aside, he said, well, Well, actually, literally, it means if God is willing. So I said, okay. And then he said, but you don't need to bother about that, okay? You know, when Egyptians say inshallah, they mean perhaps, and if you want to say perhaps, you say inshallah. So I trusted my teacher, right? Students trust their teachers, okay. So off I went. So I forgot about it. I began to speak this dreadful pidgin Arabic, okay? And off I went to work in Egypt, in this school, right? I am one of the people in this picture, right? Not the one on the right, not the one on the left. Believe it or not, I am the one in the middle, right? Standing up with blonde hair, okay? And I taught in that school. And I lived in a flat in Luxor with another English VSO teacher and some French coopérants, which is the French equivalent of VSO. And in that flat, there was an old man called Mahmoud, whose job was to, you know, do little jobs around the house, chase away the boys, you know. Okay, there were Egypt, always lots of boys, right? He's chased away the boys. So anyway, one day, well, not one day, we had a broken pipe and we asked him to mend the broken pipe. And every day we said, have you mended the broken pipe? No. When are you going? This is all in dreadful pidgin Arabic, okay? Terrible, you know. And so when are you going to mend the broken pipe? So he would say, tomorrow, inshallah. Okay. Every day, when are you going to mend the pipe? Tomorrow, inshallah. So one day, arrogant young Englishman, with my dreadful Arabic, I said, this is not good enough, Mahmoud. We want it done now. Never mind, inshallah. Okay. He was, I know that you use this phrase in Turkish, of course. He was furious. He was so angry. It ended my friendship with him completely. Because, of course, my teacher was wrong. It may function communicatively a little bit like perhaps sometimes, but it's a much more serious phrase, and it reflected a very serious view of the world for him, right? Now, the lesson of this, I think, well, there are two lessons, actually. One is that there are serious shortcomings in a language course which has no explanation and no translation and no discussion, okay? The second point, I think, is that languages are not so simple, okay, in the way they relate to each other. You can't translate this phrase from English to Arabic or English to any other language that uses this phrase, because it's a very complicated thing. It needs some explanation. Maybe it needs what a theorist called Wolfgang Butzkam calls mirror translation. Now, mirror translation is exactly the kind of thing that you shouldn't use if you are a communicative language teacher, right? Mirror translation would work something like this, okay? You break it down, right? So it becomes if, wish, God. But that's if, wish is God. But that isn't English, is it, right? That isn't grammatical English. So you would have to say something like, by the will of God. That is an English phrase, okay? But it's not an English phrase that many contemporary English speakers would use. There's also God willing, right? Which you do find some, for example, devout Catholics use. But it's very unusual now in English. So, of course, yes, in some ways, the phrase functions, communicates the same sort of meaning as English speakers mean when they say perhaps, but that is not doing any justice to the cultural and religious complexity of a phrase, okay? So maybe there is some virtue in breaking things down in this way, although, of course, this kind of attention to morphemes is not the sort of thing that we ought to be doing. But it's also, leaving aside the cultural problems of communication, it's also quite useful in terms of allowing the learner to generate correct utterances. So you could say, my Arabic pronunciation is terrible, inshallah madaris, if the teacher wants, okay? So you can generate in this way through mirror translation, for example. If you took French, this is a much less contentious comparison than the one about Arabic and English, because of all the misunderstandings, dreadful misunderstandings that there are between Arabic speakers and English speakers. But if you took s'il vous plaît, okay, very well-known French phrase, and of course the usual translation would be please, okay, but word for word, if it you pleases, that's not English, of course, that's not correct English, so you have to turn it around a little bit. If it pleases you, that's a correct English sentence, but not one anybody would say. So, if you please, okay? But of course, we don't say that very often, we just say please. Nevertheless, to break it down morpheme by morpheme is quite useful, because you can then generate other correct French sentences, si le vin vous plaît. Okay. Now, I am not recommending a return to, some kind of extreme, old-fashioned way where this is the only kind of thing one does. But what I do hope is that this little anecdote that I told you about, a dreadful misunderstanding that happened to me as a result of a complete, focus on doing everything through the language with no explanation, there is some room for a moderate use of this kind of focus on form and some kind of explicit explanation. The problem is that everybody has become extreme, okay? We're talking about timeless principles and changing trends, okay? Well, if you go back to the past and you come to the future, you find extremism at both ends, okay? There is a materials designer, you may have heard of her, called Marcia Fisk-Ong. And some years ago, she did a survey of teachers and teacher trainers about their attitude to the use of students' own languages and things like translation, things like this, in the classroom. And she found two types of reaction, right? One was a kind of, yes, it's necessary sometimes and it's a good thing to do sometimes, but we feel terribly guilty about it, right? And we don't like to admit that we do it. That was one reaction. And then another reaction was a really extreme belief that one should never, never, ever use the student's own language, right? So here's an example. A teacher trainer. I'll say that I've taken a strong stand against any use of the L1 in an L2 classroom, and all my TESOL students know that if they ever utter a word of Bahasa Malaysia in the classroom, I will burst into their classroom and strangle them in front of their students, right? How could people be so extreme, okay? I was involved in a research project recently with Graham Hall, who's now editor of English Language Teaching Journal, and we carried out a survey, this was only last year, so it's more recent, questionnaire on this issue of 2,785 teachers from 111 countries. And incidentally, the country which was most cooperative and helpful and volunteered most people in this survey was Turkey. I don't know if maybe somebody in the audience was part of the survey, I don't know. And then we did some semi-structured interviews with people from a selection of countries. And we found something a little bit different from Marcia Fisk-Ong. We found that people, the overwhelming majority of teachers we surveyed said, yes, they thought it was a good idea to explain things, to use the student's own language sometimes, and so on and so forth, but they had to pretend, almost to pretend, that they didn't or that they thought it was a bad thing. So the question for me arises, I think, how did we get from one kind of extremism to another? Okay. I've just illustrated to you an example of what I would see as contemporary extremism. This, I will burst into your classroom and strangle you in front of your students. How did we get from that to that extremism from another extremism? And how do we get back to a more reasonable balance, right? Because I'm not advocating a return to the distant past. okay? Timeless principles, maybe if you want to call it, but to achieve some kind of balance, okay? Because there's no doubt that this current extremism is a kind of reaction to an extremism in the past. So if you go back to grammar translation, which was the main staple of fashionable language teaching in the late 19th century, okay, it was, of course, very dry, very dull. It was all writing and no speaking. It was all accuracy and no fluency, all form and no communication. Lots and lots of shortcomings, okay? And it's still around today, as we know. I have a Turkish MA student on our course in King's College London, and she very kindly came up with this book which she uses to teach people Turkish in Britain. She works part-time there. So here you've got it. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this book, right? But there you have it. You know, this is all there is, okay? You learn vocabulary, okay? In translation form, you learn paradigms of translation sentences. It is necessary for me to go, it is necessary for you to go, it is necessary for him to go, and so on and so forth. And you learn a lot of grammar rules as well. This kind of thing has its merits, has its virtues, but I think we would all agree it is not enough in itself. It needs something else, okay? So what I want to do in this talk, the rest of this talk, is to try to explore, you know, what the arguments are on both sides, how it happened that there was one extreme point of view, all grammar, all form, all writing, no fluency, and how we got from that to another extreme point of view where people burst into classrooms and strangle their students, or strangle their teacher-trainer students, okay? Well, I think there are a number of possible explanations of this, okay? And one of them is simply historical. And I find this quite interesting, and I hope you do too, okay? So if you go back to the history of changing trends in English language teaching, and as I was saying at the beginning, if you go right back to the beginning of the 19th century, to the end of the 19th century, and there's a reason for this date, 1882, okay? I'll tell you in a second. Very specific date, okay? You find that at that time, the norm, right, we're talking about 150 years ago now, talk about timeless principles. At that time, the state of the art, the norm was what has been called cross-lingual teaching, right? You compare the two languages, there's lots of translation, there's lots of explanation, there's lots of grammar rules in the student's own language, okay? And all of the drawbacks that go with that, all of the drawbacks that I just mentioned. And then in 1882, and a very specific date, as I said, there was a change. Suddenly, people started to advocate what you can call intralingual teaching, all within one language, and that is also called the direct method. So why this date? Why 1882? Because two groups of people, or one group of people and one individual, at that time, both put forward an argument against interlingual teaching. One was a group of academics who called themselves the Reform Movement, changing trends, you see. People always call themselves, beware of people who call themselves the Reform Movement, I would say, right? Whether it's 1882 or 2013. Here's one of them, Henry Sweet, a very famous English academic. And he and other colleagues in Germany and England started to suggest the kind of things that we would probably agree with. You know, that you need some emphasis on fluency, you need to have connected texts, you need to practice speaking, as well as, you know, learning rules and translation and so on and so forth. Actually, a very moderate, very sensible, very reasonable attitude to English language teaching. But, now have a look at his moustache, you see. Not too big, right? A kind of moderate moustache, okay? But then along came a man with a big moustache. Right? The businessman, Maximilian Berlitz, founder of Berlitz Schools, which continue to be one of the most successful language teaching corporations in the world. And his ideas were not so moderate, okay? The Berlitz schools moving into the early 20th century were really very extreme, okay? They were on an industrial model. Their boast was that you could go anywhere in the world, go into a Berlitz school, take up the language teaching course, and you would be on the same page, right, on the same date as anybody else, anywhere else in the world. It was actually interesting, you know, Berlitz predates the Ford factory production model. It's an industrial model, okay? But also, teachers could be fired, okay, if they uttered one word, if they translated one word to a student. At some time, maybe not throughout the whole history of Berlitz, but at some point. And at some points, there were also microphones in the classrooms eavesdropping on teachers to see if they did that, okay? So you've got really a moderate view and an extreme view, okay? And this, I think, is part of the history of English language teaching. You've also got something which is also very relevant today, but let's just think about, you know, late 19th century, early 20th century. There were lots of other reasons behind the changing trends, okay? Not just, you know, what is the best way to teach or learn a language, and that remains the same. So at that time, there was a lot of immigration, especially into North America, people coming from all over the world with all sorts of different languages, and there was an interest in among the English-speaking population in North America to try to get everyone to speak English. And I'll come back to that again a bit later. There are just practical reasons. So if you have a lot of people traveling, a lot of private language schools and so on and so forth, immigrants learning English, you can't use translation and explanation for two reasons. You've got mixed language classes, you've got mixed nationalities in the classes, you've got teachers who don't speak all the languages in the class. They can't. They have to do direct method. And very often those teachers, like me when I went to Egypt, don't, you know, are woefully monolingual. You've got some things to do with the technology of publishing, which actually is changing now very much as we move, as we, you know, with computer mediated publishing. But in the days of the old, you know, printing press, it was much easier for the big publishing houses just to produce one textbook for the world, right? Let's not bother about, you know, the differences between, let's say, Turkish and Polish and Brazilian, Portuguese, and so on and so forth, okay? Just everything in English would be easier. And of course, there is a political side to it as well. The English-speaking populations of the world were only too pleased that everything was being done in English, okay? So, as always, I think, when you have timeless principles and changing trends, there are some commercial, political, practical factors as well as academic ones. So that's a historical background. Now, another thing that happened to reinforce these ideas that it's best to do things in the language being taught and it's best to focus on meaning is what might be called a scientific approach. But I've put this scientific in scare quotes because I don't think it really is that scientific, okay? But this takes us forward to around 1970, I think, and the birth of the communicative language teaching movement, of which I was a victim in 1974, okay? When there was a change from this exclusive focus on, you know, grammar rules and focus on form to supposedly, I say supposedly because it's sometimes form disguised, to a focus on meaning, right? So all of those things like, you know, the natural approach, communicative language teaching, and its successors which are with us today, like task-based teaching. And as I said at the beginning, there's really nothing terribly modern about this, right? Okay? This focus, this belief in an exclusive focus on meaning, it's now getting on for 50 years old, okay? Nothing particularly contemporary about it. And it has been supported by supposedly scientific evidence, mostly drawing upon theories of second language acquisition. So you get this kind of thing. An article not so long ago in Applied Linguistics, 2006, talking about the articles in this special issue of the journal, And it says the key question is, how well do these analyses, the analyses in that issue of the journal, succeed in generating precise predictions for patterns in language learning? Can we use these predictions to improve language learning? Okay? So it's a kind of belief in applied science, right? You can study things, you can come up with precise findings, and you can use those precise findings to improve things, right? Just as, a physicist might find out things which could improve bridge building in engineering, okay? But the problem with this, I think, is that improving in language teaching and learning is a relative concept, right? It's not an absolute concept. You can't talk about whether things are improving unless you know what people's aims are, okay? And one of the things I want to come on to suggest is that the aims of people learning languages, and people learning English in particular in the contemporary world, are rather different from what they were in 1970. This is a changing trend, okay? The assumption in this kind of literature is that the aim of the English language learner is to operate in a monolingual context, okay? To use English as though you were suddenly some kind of monolingual English person in London, surrounded by other monolingual English learners, English speakers, okay? But as many people have pointed out for quite a long time, okay, it depends whether you think that is the criterion of success. As Sridhar and Sridhar said, SLA researchers seem to have neglected the fact that the goal of second language acquisition is to be bilingual, okay? What many learners are trying to achieve is not to become a kind of pretend native English speaker, but to be a person who can move backwards and forwards between English and another language. This is what people often need to do, most often need to do probably, in the contemporary world. And there are lots of authentic contemporary situations where this is going on all the time, okay? So, for example, mixed language partnerships, marriages, and so on, and relationships, okay? There's, going to be an awful lot of moving backwards and forwards between one language and another. Migrant families, right? Migration, these things have always been an issue in the world, okay? But they suddenly have a certain, new urgency in contemporary times. Migrant families are operating all the time in more than one language. In schools. In London at the moment, surveys show that there are around 350 different languages spoken in London schools, okay? So there is an awful lot of negotiation between languages among pupils and with their parents and so on and so forth. Workforces. In the contemporary world, we often have workforces of mixed nationalities and languages where they are, speaking different languages, moving backwards and forwards between languages, using English as a lingua franca and so on and so forth. International businesses, multilingual notices and announcements, and multiple language use on the internet. All of these things I'll come back to a bit later. So that's one problem with this apparently scientific approach. It depends, right? You can't talk about improvement unless you know what people want to do, okay? If your criterion for successful language learning is to be able to translate accurately silly sentences, right? Then grammar translation is the thing for you, okay? If you want to go into a bar in London, as they did in the communicative language teaching ideas of the 1970s, and pass off as a native speaker, okay, well, maybe that's for you, okay? But maybe in the contemporary world, things are a little bit different. The second problem with the scientific approach is that, believe it or not, there isn't actually any research, or there hasn't been until very recently, on whether bilingual teaching is more successful than monolingual teaching. Here's a couple of quotations from some quite recent articles on this, okay? Unfortunately, says one author, the references are available at the end if you want them. Empirical work on the effect of translation exercises on second language learners' morphosyntax is scant. Well, scant is an understatement. There really isn't any, actually. Or another article from 2008, to our knowledge, no research has examined the value of contrastive form-focused instruction of vocabulary, such as interlingual comparisons with learners' first language or translation. Okay? It was regarded as so wrong ever to use translation or refer to the student's first language by mainstream second language acquisition theory from the 1970s onwards that there actually was no research at all. Here's a comment by the person who has the most encyclopedic knowledge of second language acquisition in the world, Rod Ellis, who I kind of lazily asked him by email whether this was the case, and he replied, yes, you're right, there is no research on the use of translation. So some serious shortcomings there. Now, so I've looked at some historical reasons for this change, and I've looked at some supposedly scientific reasons. Let's now think about the pedagogy, the pedagogic issues, okay? Pedagogy is concerned really with how to make things work in the classroom, how to motivate students. And I draw on a most unlikely source, right, for an interesting point of view on this, okay? Noam Chomsky, the arch theoretical linguist with nothing to say much about language teaching and looking very, very happy with a lovely smile, okay? And criticizing the kind of second language acquisition research people, saying psychology and linguistics have caused a good deal of harm by pretending to have answers to those questions and telling teachers how they should behave. Often the ideas presented by the scientists are totally crazy and they may cause trouble. The truth of the matter is that about 99% of teaching is making the students feel interested in the material. Well, 99% might be rather extreme, okay, but it's a valid point of view, I think, isn't it? So, again, however, we have an absence of research. Zoltan Dernier, who is, like Rod Ellis for SLA, on motivation regarded as a leading authority, says, I haven't heard of any data-based motivation studies that used L1 use in the classroom as a motivational value. It just wasn't considered an issue, okay? But I think if you go back to my diagram of changing trends, the theme of the conference, right, you find that now, 2013, there is something of a movement towards reassessing the use of students' own languages in the classroom. I'm using the word own language rather than first language or native language or mother tongue, right? Because in the modern world in particular, I think, you're not necessarily talking about a first language or a native language. Lots of people are learning, the issue is not whether to use their first language or... Well, let me give you a concrete example. Sorry, I'm getting a bit tangled up here, okay? If you take students in London whose first language is Turkish, of which there are a lot, okay, and they're learning French at school, okay, the issue is not whether to do it in Turkish and French, but whether to do it in English and French, because English is the language of the school, although it's not their first language. Do you see what I mean, okay? And mother tongue becomes a crazy phrase in the modern world because a lot of people's mother tongue is not their mother's mother tongue, if you see what I mean. Okay, right. Okay, anyway, there's something of a movement which I think is called, which I would like to call the own language movement, and again, Graham Hall, with whom I collaborate quite a lot, and I have, if you're interested, done a survey of views of current research on own language use in the journal Language Teaching, and this was published last year. And just to go through some of these pedagogic arguments for own language use and some of the people who've put them forward in recent years. The first thing to say, which Henry Widdowson points out, is that if you want to talk about natural language learning, which is, one of the buzzwords of the last 20 years or so, nothing could be more natural than trying to relate the language you're learning to the language you already know. And if you think that you can stamp that out, as the man with the big moustache did, okay, you're wrong. There's nothing you can do. People will do it anyway. If you forbid them to translate or explain, they will whisper to each other, they will look it up on the internet, they will look in a book, they will talk to the teacher outside the classroom or somebody else outside the classroom like I did, okay? You just can't stop it. It's natural and inevitable. Second point is that it can be stress reducing. Suresh Kanagaraja, writing about Sri Lanka, makes the point that if you use the student's own language, and nobody's talking about using it in excess, okay? We're talking about a moderate, reasonable, controlled use, okay? But if you refuse to do it, that can be very stressful, okay? It puts students at ease, conveys teachers' empathy, and in general can create a less threatening atmosphere. It promotes teacher-student understanding. This is a most interesting article by somebody called Edstrom in the United States, and she started off a bit like Berlitz, actually, with a very extreme view that, you know, she shouldn't be using the student's first language at all. But she came to the conclusion, very open-mindedly, that actually, if she wanted to create good relationships with the students, she needed to talk to them in the shared first language, which in their case was English. And it can be communicative, right? This article by somebody called Brooks Lewis in Applied Linguistics in 2009, she recounts her own experiences as a beginner learner of Spanish. I'm not reading these through. I hope you can sort of read them from where you are, yeah? And she refers to it as, I felt I walked into the second act of a 3-act play and I'd gotten into the wrong classroom. That it just didn't seem natural or communicative or the best way to go about things to suddenly be thrown into the deep end, as they used to say in communicative language teaching. You know, it can be just very disorienting. And also, of course, it infantilizes adult learners. It makes them feel suddenly as though they have no knowledge, no knowledge of their own which is relevant to what's happening. One could also say that it promotes learning, okay? It can give people a sense of confidence and organization. It can give people explicit knowledge, okay? Explicit knowledge means that you're not just able to use things, but you know what is happening. So if you said inshallah or s'il vous plaît, meaning whatever you mean by them, okay? You also are aware of how it breaks down, what it means, what the differences are, and so on and so forth. If I had had that when I spoke to Mahmoud, I would not have fallen out with him. It stops students. Now, this is an interesting thing about translation, actually, which has become such a crime in the modern world. You know, if you just let people communicate their meaning, right, they can constantly avoid things that they know they have a problem with, okay? Now, I know this as a language learner myself, that in languages I speak, if there's some aspect of the grammar or some word or some pronunciation that I'm not happy about, I don't feel confident about, I just feel it coming up and I avoid it. I find some circumlocution, some way of not using the subjunctive or not making that sound or whatever. But if you say to somebody, translate this, okay, they can't do that. And then you can find the weakness and do something about it, okay? That's not to say that all you should do is translate, but sometimes it might be useful. Not falling for faux amis, okay? Faux amis are words which seem to be the same, but they aren't. They are false friends, okay? An example would be simpatico in Italian, okay? Quest'uomo è molto simpatico does not mean this man is very sympathetic, okay? It means this man is very likable. Okay, same in Turkish. Okay, thank you. Okay. So somebody in a communicative classroom could keep saying questo uomo è molto simpatico, and it's a correct sentence, and nobody would be aware that they don't understand the difference. But if they were asked to translate it, then you would spot the error, okay? Or, as used to happen to me, I also worked in Italy, you know, coffee makes me nervous, right? But nervoso is not quite nervous. It's more, I don't know how to translate it, okay? It acknowledges student expertise, right? If you say to students, well, how does this work in your language, okay? Then they have something to contribute. It makes them feel good because they know something that they can contribute. And of course, it's very curious, the notion of direct method, because one of the main principles of language learning is, not of language learning, one of the main principles of learning theory, most people would agree, is that you achieve new knowledge by linking the new to the old. If you forbid people from ever referring to their own language, you just cut that off at root. How am I doing for time? I have 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, well, I may have to miss a few things out. Okay. I'll miss that one out. Okay. And so, lastly, I've looked at some historical reasons, quasi-scientific reasons, pedagogic reasons. Let's think about education. What do I mean by education? Okay. Well, now we move on to some issues which are very much to do with the contemporary world, I hope. Okay. We're talking about timeless principles like linking new knowledge to old knowledge, but we're also talking about changing trends. And I think although there are timeless principles, there are also things that are very particularly new about the contemporary world, okay, the world that we live in. And some of these I've referred to as I've gone along. So we're talking about 2013 now, okay? Multiple language use, where people are mixing languages, moving between languages all the time, is something which people looking at contemporary language use, especially on the internet, are finding is a growing phenomenon. There is an increase and a kind of added urgency about mobile, migrant, multilingual populations. A lot of communication now is not face-to-face in some coffee bar in London, as it was in communicative language teaching materials of the 1970s. It's online, written, internet communication. It's not exactly writing, it's not exactly speech, it's something between the two. And English is a lingua franca, not only a native language. In fact, if you look at these statistics, you know, you have to take them with a pinch of salt because they're changing all the time. But these are the kind of figures that people looking at English language use in the world come up with. And it makes it clear, I think, that that a lot of English language communication in the world, maybe most of the English language communication in the world, is no longer between a learner or a non-native user of English and a native speaker of English. It's between people for neither of whom English is a native language. And all of these factors are bound to create a new learning and using environment. If you get a job, right, on the basis around the world, on the basis of the fact that you speak good English, right, the chances are that what you will be asked to do in that job is not move into a monolingual, native-speaking environment where you're using only English. No, you will be negotiating backwards and forwards between people who speak English but not your language and people who speak your language but not very good English, okay? Okay, get a job, maybe I'm being presumptuous to say things about Turkey, I don't know, but get a job in a business in Turkey on the grounds that you speak good English, right? That's what you would surely be doing, moving backwards and forwards between languages. There is also a very political dimension to the issue of direct method in the contemporary world. English, as those figures I just showed you, has become the world's language. This has accelerated since, let's say, 1970. So now English is, without doubt, the international language of the world, okay? This raises very significant political and cultural issues, right? How do we preserve people's identity, non-native English speakers' identity and independence in a world where English becomes dominant, right? Where, for example, there is very little translation out of other languages into English, right? English is in danger of dominating other languages. And in the United States, there is a rather unpleasant political movement, the English-only movement, trying to say that we don't want anybody to speak any other language. Everybody should speak English. English only, no Spanish. When ordering, speak English, okay? English only, please. This looks like the cover of an English language textbook. It isn't. It's a sign on entering some Midwest town where the local legislature passed a rule that in this town you should only speak English, okay? It looks very nice, you know, everybody's smiling and so on, but it's a little bit sinister. It's as though you have this kind of rather unpleasant nationalistic slogan used especially in Europe about promoting national identity. One nation, one people, one language suddenly becomes one classroom, one learner, one language, okay? So there is that kind of political dimension to things, which is what I would call an educational issue. So just to sum up, okay, what I've been saying is that direct method has some disadvantages, and I have to go through these quite fast, I'm afraid. Whereas own language use in a moderate form has no sound scientific evidence against it. It makes pedagogic sense sometimes. It can be very relevant and very useful. It can maintain diversity and identity. It builds upon student knowledge, and it promotes language awareness. And it acknowledges that you can't translate it, that there are things about languages that don't just lift into other languages very easily. That goes back to my opening anecdote. But there's a very important thing here, and I want to stress this very strongly as my final point, okay? We are not talking about a return to an excessive or extreme use of the first language as the only medium of teaching. We're not talking about, I am not talking about overuse or even making it a major use again. Not talking about some kind of unplanned incidental occurrence where people do it without really knowing what they're doing, or resorting to own language use, which a lot of teachers do when they're just tired or short of time, right? It's obviously a way of doing things quickly, easily, if you are, as of course teachers all are, all over the world, very often tired and very short of time. What is important is to make it an alternative to extremism, an alternative to both ends of the extremism spectrum, whether it's the grammar translation end or the strangling your students in front of their class, right, end, okay? So it would be, and I'm citing a few researchers here, I've got the references in the last slide if anybody wants them, a judicious or optimal own language use, an appropriate combination of the two languages, a structured and principled deployment of the own language. These are all people who have campaigned for a reasonable, measured, balanced use of the two. And that's really the sort of theme of this talk that I want to leave with you, that it's time, you talk about timeless principles and changing trends. Well, a timeless principle should be that we maintain a sensible, reasonable balance between a direct method and communicative approach, and one which makes a good, judicious, helpful use of reference to the student's own language. And that would be a new trend. So a timeless principle and a changing trend. And there's a lot of references here, as I've said, which, if anybody is interested, I would be happy to send or leave behind here. Right, thank you very much, and I hope I haven't run too much over time.